Steve McQueen wasn't just another Hollywood star. He was a phenomenon wrapped in a leather jacket, perpetually braced for the next turn in the road. His reputation as the king of cool came from more than just his tough guy stare or his iconic roles. It was shaped by the jagged edges of a youth spent dodging fists and fate, the disciplined chaos of his time in the military, and the adrenaline-fueled mania of racing cars and motorcycles. He carried rebellion in his veins. He lived by the seat of his pants. And somewhere in that collision of swagger, skill, and luck, he forged an identity so distinctive that decades after his death, people still hold him up as the very embodiment of raw, unpolished cool. But Steve McQueen's story didn't begin on a glamorous film set. It began in hardship, shaped by a father who vanished and a mother who was never able to give him the stability he needed. By the time he was 9, he was on the streets. By his teens, he had joined and quit multiple jobs in exotic places, and it only grew more turbulent from there. Picture a small boy named Steve, born to William McQueen, a barnstorming stunt pilot in flying circuses, and a 20-year-old mother named Julia who had yet to figure out her own life. William was the first source of Steve's need for speed. Perhaps it was genetic. The man spent his days flipping biplanes in the open sky, risking life and limb for the roar of the crowd. So is it any wonder that Steve felt an unexplainable pull toward fast cars and roaring engines? Unfortunately, William's sense of responsibility didn't match his daring. After just 6 months with Julia, he vanished, leaving her pregnant and alone. Steve grew up never knowing the father who'd inadvertently ignited his passion for danger. Julia, for her part, wasn't much better as a guiding force. She was young, she was unsettled, and she struggled with alcoholism. Worse yet, she had a habit of choosing violent, abusive men. Realizing she was in no shape to care for a child, she sent Steve to live with his grandparents in Slater, Missouri. By all accounts, that farm in Missouri was the closest thing to a stable childhood Steve ever had, a place where he found a sense of belonging, learned basic manners, and briefly discovered that there could be tenderness in the world. But this glimpse of normalcy was short-lived. Julia reappeared, deciding on a whim to bring him back to the city so they could live as a proper family again. It was anything but proper. Steve struggled with dyslexia and a hearing problem, and neither issue got him much sympathy at home. His new stepfather was a brute, taking out his frustrations in drunken rages and leaving the boy battered and beaten. Imagine being 9 years old, caught between an alcoholic mother and a violent stepfather, with no refuge to flee to except the streets. And so, at the age of 9, Steve packed up what little spirit he had left and took off. The city streets became his domain. He wandered day by day, learning quickly that the only way to survive was to act tough. In Indianapolis, he found acceptance, if you can call it that, by joining a gang of kids who were neck-deep in petty crime, small-time theft, hustling, picking pockets, anything to keep themselves fed or to buy a fleeting moment of excitement. Steve's mother was horrified at how fast he was slipping into juvenile delinquency, so in desperation she sent him back to Missouri to live with the family again. But her own life was no more stable. Whenever she found yet another man who eventually grew abusive, she'd yank Steve away and relocate him to a new city. At 12, he landed in Los Angeles, a place that for many represented a dream, but for Steve it became yet another proving ground for misery. Julia's third husband was just as violent as the first two, and Steve found himself stuck in a perpetual cycle. Fight with his stepfather, storm out, live on the streets. Over and over the same pattern repeated itself. By 14, he'd had enough. Any illusions of a normal adolescence had evaporated. He ran away from his uncle's farm for good and somehow wound up joining a traveling circus. If that sounds fantastical, well, it was. But for a restless spirit like Steve, a circus was just another chance to test his own limits. He didn't last long there, eventually drifting back to his mother in Los Angeles, only to become ensnared in a new and brutal conflict with his stepfather. When he was caught stealing hubcaps, the police brought him straight home, thinking that a stern father figure might set him straight. Instead, the stepfather unleashed a savage beating, finishing by shoving Steve down the stairs in a rage. That was the day Steve looked up at the man, tasting blood and tears, and made a threat that would shape the course of his life. "If you ever touch me again, I swear I'll kill you." Something in his voice made them believe he would do it. It was the final straw. Julia and her husband signed papers declaring him incorrigible, and Steve was sent off to a reform school called the California Junior Boys Republic in Chino. Boys Republic was no day camp. Steve got bullied the minute he arrived, physically pounded by other kids who were tired of collective punishment whenever one boy broke the rules. But in that tough environment, he discovered a certain resilience. Once again, he learned to fight back. Gradually, as he found his footing, he became a role model for the other so-called troublemakers, demonstrating that if you kept your wits about you and never backed down, you could earn respect. Even after he left at 16, that place left its imprint on him. Decades later, he returned time and again to visit the Boys Republic, donating not just money but also time, experience, and genuine camaraderie to kids who were walking the same treacherous road he once walked. After Chino, Steve tried living with Julia in New York for a spell, but city living and family obligations chafed him raw. He was already itching to see the world on his own terms. Through a few acquaintances, he joined the Merchant Marines, shipping off to the Dominican Republic. The open sea might have presented a new horizon, but Steve's rebelliousness was uncontainable. As soon as the ship landed, he quit. Over the next couple of years, he hopped between bizarre odd jobs, working in a brothel in the Dominican Republic, drifting into a traveling fair, heading up to Canada to chop logs in remote timber camps. By the time he was 17, he'd seen more corners of life than most men twice his age. But perhaps the most surprising turn came in 1947, when Steve joined the U.S. Marine Corps. He had to convince his mother to sign the papers because he was still underage. Maybe she hoped the Marines would straighten him out before he spiraled into a life of crime. And for a while, it seemed like the structure did him some good. McQueen showed promise, rising to private first class. But that old rebellious streak was never far beneath the surface. He got demoted 7 times. He overstayed his leave with a girlfriend and ended up in a military brig for 41 days. What saved him from a dishonorable discharge was one heroic act. During a training exercise in the Arctic, a ship ran aground, pitching several Marines into the icy water. Steve risked his life to pull 5 of them to safety. His superiors recognized that beneath that defiant attitude lay a man capable of genuine courage. When his service ended, McQueen returned to civilian life. In 1952, he used the GI Bill to study acting in New York City, enrolling with famous teachers like Sanford Meisner and Uta Hagen. In that era, countless hopefuls poured into the city, dreaming of making it big on the stage or screen. But something about Steve made him stand out. It wasn't just his chiseled cheekbones, it was the sense that he'd lived the life of 20 men already, that you could see shadows of real danger in his eyes. He started dating an aspiring actress named Gia Scala. That romance didn't last. He was too busy racing motorcycles on the weekends to help pay for classes. Racing, in fact, became a near obsession. While other struggling actors waited tables, Steve risked life and limb at dusty tracks, pulling in roughly $100 a weekend, worth about 1,000 in today's money. That high-octane hustle helped keep him afloat while he honed his craft. By 1955, he drifted to Los Angeles, the epicenter of American film and television. A year later, he married an actress-dancer named Neely Adams. They had 2 children, and at least in the early days, formed a relatively stable family. But McQueen's big breakthrough didn't come courtesy of a prestigious studio production. It came from a campy, low-budget horror movie called The Blob in 1958. Audiences probably didn't expect that film, about a gelatinous alien, would become a cult classic, nor that its star would soon catapult into Hollywood's A-list. But that's exactly what happened. Despite being paired with a B-movie titled I Married a Monster from Outer Space, The Blob put Steve on the map. Before long, he landed a lead role in the TV Western series Wanted, Dead, or Alive, playing a bounty hunter with a sawed-off rifle and a quiet, lethal coolness. Gone was the drifting delinquent. He was now a bona fide star. That pivot to success only amplified his appetite for risk. In films like The Magnificent Seven, 1960, and The Great Escape, 1963, he insisted on doing many of his own stunts, be it galloping horses or barreling motorcycles over fences. He wanted authenticity, and audiences loved it. He wouldn't let stuntmen handle a vehicle if he could do it himself, a practice that made insurance companies sweat and directors tear out their hair. But for McQueen, it was non-negotiable. Perhaps it was also a way to feed that inner rebel who needed a steady fix of adrenaline to feel alive. While colleagues admired his talent, they quickly learned about his wayward heart. He was, bluntly put, a ladies' man who didn't mind crossing moral lines. In the early 1960s, he got linked to top models and fellow actresses, including Lauren Hutton and Mamie Van Doren, the latter a wild Hollywood blonde bombshell who claimed she and McQueen partied with mind-altering substances, ignoring any inconvenient truths like his marriage to Neela. His behavior was an infidelity with a dash of reckless abandon, a pattern that would soon leave heartbreak in its wake. But it was 1968's Bullet that crowned him the undisputed king of cool. Set in San Francisco, the film had everything: a stoic detective, gripping tension, and, most memorably, an electrifying car chase that roared through the city's steep streets. McQueen was in his element, behind the wheel of a green Ford Mustang GT, demanding meticulous control over the stunts, pushing for authenticity that made Hollywood executives squirm. Filming Bullet was a nightmare of budget overruns and schedule delays. The studio feared financial ruin, and even McQueen's star power seemed at risk if the film flopped. In the midst of this mounting pressure, the production was forced to cut ties with him on a lucrative 7-picture deal, apparently convinced they had a dud on their hands. But when Bullet finally hit theaters, it was a massive box office triumph, bringing in 10 times its production cost. The same executives who'd torn up his contract came crawling back to renegotiate, and Steve told them where to go. Suddenly, he could name his own terms, an independent force who had proved that his instincts were spot on. Behind the scenes, however, he was battling personal demons. In 1969, the Manson family unleashed a wave of terror in Los Angeles, murdering Steve's friends Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring. Rumors surfaced that McQueen's name was on Charles Manson's so-called hit list. Spooked, he started carrying a gun with him everywhere, a .38 revolver stashed in his belt, constantly looking over his shoulder. Success was supposed to bring security, but instead, it just brought more reasons to watch his back. Meanwhile, his marriage to Neela Adams was disintegrating. Although they'd been together for well over a decade, a series of infidelities, plus his growing addiction to drugs and alcohol had pulled them apart. In 1971, Neil had an abortion, a traumatic event that further fractured their relationship. Steve, it seemed, was already checking out emotionally, his attention drifting to new conquests. During the filming of The Getaway, 1972, he began an affair with co-star Ali MacGraw, then married to Paramount executive Robert Evans. Both she and Steve left their respective spouses, causing a sensational scandal that fed tabloid headlines. In 1973, they married each other in a swirl of publicity, for it was indeed the union of two high-profile Hollywood names. Some friends said Ali MacGraw was the great love of his life, but even that marriage proved rocky. Steve's paranoia and controlling behavior clashed with Ali's gentler nature. They argued over his constant partying, his possessive jealousy, and the direction of their lives. A tragic miscarriage only added to their sorrow. By 1978, they divorced, marking yet another emotional collapse in Steve's life. By that time, in the mid to late 1970s, Steve McQueen, the same man who had soared so high, was drifting out of Hollywood's spotlight. He took off in a massive recreational vehicle, crossing the country anonymously, showing up at motorcycle races under assumed names. He was no longer enthralled by big-budget sets or the glitz of stardom. Some suspected he was running from the ghosts of his childhood, or the fear that maybe he'd lose his edge if he stayed in the system. What's certain is that his consumption of alcohol, cigarettes, and drugs took a noticeable toll. That restless, rebellious spirit was no longer just a personality quirk. It was devouring him from the inside. Even so, romance found him once again. After divorcing Ali MacGraw, he noticed a model named Barbara Minty in a magazine. Something about her face captivated him. Typical McQueen fashion, he had his agent track her down and invite her to dinner. Their chemistry must have been real because Barbara became his third wife, standing by him when his health started to deteriorate. And deteriorate it did. By the late 1970s, Steve developed a persistent cough he couldn't shake. He had quit smoking, tried to moderate his vices, but the hacking cough refused to let go. Alarmingly, it grew worse, and doctors eventually diagnosed him with mesothelioma, an aggressive cancer of the lung lining. The probable cause? Asbestos exposure, likely from his time in the Marines, from the protective race suits he wore, or even from film sets that used asbestos-laden materials for special effects or set designs. In those days, the link between asbestos and deadly cancers was less well understood, or conveniently ignored by certain industries. Regardless, by the time Steve's condition was discovered, it was far advanced. True to form, McQueen tried to keep his illness under wraps. He hated the idea of pity or weakness, but the National Enquirer discovered the story, blasting headlines that the king of cool was dying. Fans responded with concern and letters of support, but Steve sank deeper into desperation. With no cure in sight, he looked for experimental treatments, traveling to Mexico to consult with William Donald Kelly, a notorious practitioner who claimed to have found a way to cure cancer through questionable regimens. Kelly, having lost his dentistry license, offered McQueen everything from coffee enemas and vitamin injections to the injection of cattle and sheep cells. The treatments cost a fortune and provided no real relief. Steve spent thousands each month chasing a miracle that never arrived. There was, however, one last gamble. In October 1980, faced with a massive tumor that weighed over 2 pounds on his liver, McQueen agreed to a highly risky surgery in a small clinic in Juarez, Mexico. Doctors in the United States had warned him it might be suicidal. His heart was too weak to endure such an invasive procedure. But defiance and hope, a cocktail that had always fueled him, propelled him to sign into the clinic under a pseudonym, Samuel Shepard. Despite his will to fight, the operation proved catastrophic. In the early hours of November 7, 1980, he suffered a heart attack and died. He was just 50 years old. When the news broke, Hollywood went into shock. For many, Steve McQueen had seemed invincible, the man who leaped barbed wire fences on a Triumph motorcycle and outran assassins in screeching car chases. How could that life force, so reckless, so alive, be snuffed out by something as mundane as cancer? His fans mourned, his co-stars paid tribute, and the legend of the King of Cool soared to near mythic proportions. The King of Cool died at 50, a rebel to the last, leaving us an iconic image that never grew old or compromised. He never faded into an aging star picking up minor roles. He burned brightly, then vanished, ensuring that we'd always remember him at the height of his defiance. Perhaps that's precisely how he'd have wanted it. And so, the legacy of Steve McQueen remains: fast, flawed, larger than life, and unforgettably cool.